And then I dreamed a monologue about a nervous guy. And I got up and wrote the rest of the monologue and did it on The Tonight Show.
During Barney Fife, Don Knotts made America chuckle for decades. However, everything changed when his daughter discovered his personal writings. Behind the well-known smile was a brutal upbringing that would follow him for the rest of his life. Knives were held to his throat by his own father. He had a covert prescription medication addiction when he was a toddler and was unable to leave his bed before important performances. His secret despair caused his marriages to fall apart. The man who brought joy to everyone was concealing such intense pain that it almost ruined him. On July 21, 1924, Don Knotts was born in Morgantown, West Virginia. Of his 4 boys, he was the youngest. Followed by his next oldest brother by 14 years, a month prior, his parents had been forced to move into a rented boarding house after losing their farm due to the Great Depression. Don later acknowledged that he had little hope when he was born. His family was already emotionally and financially exhausted and worn out. His entrance was first perceived as more of a burden than a benefit. William Knotts, Don's father, had a disease known as hysterical blindness, schizophrenia, and excessive drinking. Don's father used to get very angry while he was still a toddler. He would brandish knives at Don, pin him to the wall, and yell threats. He even occasionally put blades to Don's throat. Don was just 2 or 3 years old when these moments began. His father was admitted to an institution after multiple hospital stays. Don was 13 when he passed away. He never really recovered from the fear of those formative years. Don battled anxiety and severe depression as an adult, constantly seeking protection that he had never experienced as a child. It was a little dangerous house. In the kitchen, Don slept, and the living room, where his father frequently reclined on the couch, was directly in front of the path leading to the remainder of the house. Traveling late at night felt like a game of life or death. Don might encounter a knife or yelled threats if his father stirred. He was always afraid. At one point, his mother asked him whether he could recall the moment his father put a knife to his throat. Though he remained silent, the recollections persisted. Don went white. He is frequently ill and terrified to move about his own home. There was no defense from his elder brothers. They were already ensnared in drinking and were almost 10 years older. Rather than offering assistance, they made fun of Don, made him feel isolated, and teased him. One brother, known only as Shadow, died young and was remembered primarily for his mischievous antics. He also played cruel jokes. Don wasn't only afraid, he felt unwelcome. Neither his father nor his brothers, nor even his own thoughts, provided him with a secure haven. Despite his deep melancholy, Don managed to find methods to escape. At an early age, he began to create characters, create voices, and perform. To amuse anybody who would listen, he constructed a dummy named Danny. This allowed him to connect and gave him a tiny sensation of power. And a hiding spot. He even played with Danny for soldiers in the Pacific Theater during World War II. He later acknowledged, however, that he detested the dummy. He threw Danny overboard and said he was missing in action one day following a performance. A turning point was reached at that moment. Instead of performing as a puppet, Don wanted to be himself. He wasted little time after graduating from high school in 1942. He hopped a bus to New York City with Danny in hand just a few weeks after turning 18. The city disagreed with his belief that he was prepared for stardom. His performance was a complete failure. Agents of casting were not impressed. Quietly, he went back to Morgantown with little money and no employment. At a grocery shop, he cleaned poultry while attempting to get over the humiliation. But he clung to the dream despite losing. Don was enlisted into the Army in 1943. He signed a waiver and went, despite being 1 pound under the weight limit. After joining the Special Services section, he appeared on the Stars and Gripes variety show for soldiers. After starting with Danny, he quickly came to the conclusion that ventriloquism was not his calling. He gave it up entirely and concentrated on comedy after receiving support from other performers. He honed the twitchy, anxious personality that would eventually become his signature. He developed a voice that sounded authentically his and had received multiple awards by the time he left the Army in 1946. He performed in every play he could while studying English because the school did not offer a theatrical major. In 1948, he received his degree. He fell in love with Catherine Metz, a Baptist minister's daughter at this period. In 1947, they tied the knot in a modest Wheeling church. Don wasn't well known at the time. The marriage gave him strength, although the wedding hardly made the local press. Even when his crazy dreams had nothing, Catherine encouraged them. Don borrowed $100 and gambled on New York once more in 1949. This time he had a wife who supported him, military pals, and experience. Still, it wasn't simple. Despite his frequent rejections, he managed to secure a modest radio job as Windy Wales, a smoldering old cowboy on the Bobby Benson Show. For 6 years, the show ran. He thereafter found work in soap operas and tiny clubs. He portrayed a very disturbed young man on the soap series Search for Tomorrow from 1953 until 1955. The individual would only talk to his sister because he was so traumatized. Unbelievably, Don excelled at his one and only dramatic part. He performed live week after week on a show that ran at a time when most television was not even on tape. Although it wasn't very high, the income was consistent. That meant the world to a young actor in the early 1950s. That performance gave Don security in addition to money. Additionally, it allowed him the room to envision creating something completely different. When Don appeared on The Steve Allen Show in 1956, that dream gained attention. Millions of people watched the fast-paced, chaotic variety show, and Don immediately jumped out. He never yelled, sang, or made loud jokes. He played a scared character, frightened in fact. In interviews, he was the shaky-handed surgeon, the poor person who had to replace the pins and hand grenades, and the trembling guy. Viewers were unable to turn away. His voice cracked, his eyes grew big, and all of a sudden, anxiousness was hilarious. The anxious man's character stayed with him throughout his life. To the public, it became who he was. People laughed more each time he stumbled and flinched on TV. It wasn't only a hit, it turned as his signature. Fans were unaware that the terror was more than a facade. Don was genuinely anxious. Off-screen, he experienced such severe anxiety that he occasionally couldn't leave his bed before important performances. He would be struck like a wall by the fear. He sought help from therapists and made every effort to cope. However, it never entirely disappeared. He suffered because of what made people laugh. Nevertheless, he persevered through it repeatedly. Real agony was the source of his twitchy, uncertain stage persona, which was his greatest asset as a performer. His characters have depth because of his sensitivity. They weren't merely foolish. They were people. The year 1955 was the most significant turning point. Got a little part in No Time for Sergeants, a Broadway comedy. Andy Griffith, a humorist from the South with a natural charm, was the star. Don's role was short, but what transpired backstage would alter the course of events. Andy and he clicked. They became great friends over 796 performances. Don followed when the drama was made into a film in 1958. More work was not the only outcome of that connection. The Andy Griffith Show was the result. The Andy Griffith Show did not have a plan for a clumsy deputy when it began in 1960. Don Knotts, however, had different plans. He had just seen the pilot after leaving the Steve Allen Show. "You're going to be a sheriff," he told Andy Griffith over the phone immediately after seeing it. "You will require a deputy." He should phone the producer, Andy said. Leonard Sheldon. Don was in an instant. Barney Fife, the overconfident deputy with only one bullet in his shirt pocket, was introduced to the Globe within weeks. By the second episode, Andy had come to a significant realization. Perhaps the true star of the show is this strange little fellow. They clicked right away. Years later, Barney Fife was ranked as the 9th greatest TV character of all time by TV Guide. Don Knotts won 5 Emmy Awards for his portrayal of Barney between 1960 and 1965. 1961, 1962, 1963, 1966, and 1967 were his victories. No other comic supporting actor had ever done that at the time. Despite the presence of celebrities like Robert Redford and George C. Scott, Don's nervous, bug-eyed deputy continued to beat them. He received the call regarding his first nomination while painting a fence in his garden. "I had always been a prepared loser," he added afterwards. sake. But he continued to win year after year. No one had surpassed his streak by 2025. At first, Andy Griffith wanted to be the one with the jokes. However, when Don played the idiot and played it straight in the second episode, Manhunt, he witnessed how much more powerful the show was. Later, Andy stated, "I knew by that episode that I should play straight and Don should be the comic. That was the key distinction. Everything was shaped by that shift. Andy stood quietly next to Don, giving him the room he needed to be boisterous, apprehensive, and amusing." Their timing served as a model for later sitcoms. The characters' bond felt genuine, and the chuckles came more quickly. The show was popular in addition to being humorous. The Andy Griffith Show never fell below 7th place in the Nielsen ratings between 1960 and 1968. It was the most popular show in America at the end of its last season. Seinfeld and I Love Lucy are the only ones who have done that. Barney wasn't merely a supporting figure. He became the most adored face. In order to feel more connected to the Mayberry universe, several fans even relocated to Mount Airy, Andy's hometown. 5 million Americans were still watching the show daily in 1998. Every year, Mayberry Days continues to unite enthusiasts in North Carolina with Days in North Carolina. However, Don's life was considerably more difficult behind the scenes. Doctors prescribed him anxiety medicine in the 1950s, even before Mayberry. He suffered from panic episodes and was always afraid of his health. Prescription drug addiction resulted from that. At his worst, he was unable to leave his bed for performances. He accidentally took too many sleeping tablets once. His private life suffered. His family and marriages suffered, but he resisted. He abruptly stopped taking the medicines following a health crisis and a firm warning from his third wife, Alton. In 1965, he also quit the Andy Griffith program. By doing that, he left the character that served to mask the terror he harbored within. Don had a strategy before he left. He signed a 5-picture deal with Universal Pictures because he thought the show would stop after season 5. However, Andy made the decision to continue. It was too late at that time. Don had made a commitment. The change was not warmly received by fans. Despite Jerry Van Dyke's best efforts, Barney could not be replaced. Don returned for guest appearances in 1966 and 1967, and those performances earned him 2 additional Emmys. He now had 5, which is still the most for a single supporting comic part. The Incredible Mr. Limpid, released in 1964, was Don's major film debut. It combined live action and animation. Critics were dubious about Don's portrayal of a timid guy who transforms into a fish and aids the Navy in battling German submarines, but the public adored it. Through TV replays, it eventually became into a cult favorite. Lou Wasserman of Universal granted Don a long-term deal because he was so impressed. Don was able to sell tickets without Barney Fife because to that one movie. Don featured in a series of popular comedies for Universal beginning in 1966. The Ghost and Mr. Chicken made 5 times the $670,000 it originally cost. Then followed The Reluctant Astronaut in 1967, which nearly doubled its cost and made $1.05 million in 6 months. In 1968, he released The Shakiest Gun in the West. Don became more than simply a humorous TV character thanks to these films. He turned into a consistent box office attraction. He and Tim Conway collaborated on Disney's The Apple Dumpling Gang in 1975. Their chemistry was flawless. Families enjoyed their silly slapstick, and the movie was so successful that Disney produced a follow-up 4 years later. People of all ages found humor in Don. He's shown his ability to lead a hit even outside of Universal. Disney was able to maintain its leadership in family entertainment because to his films. Till the middle of the 1970s, Don Knotts was more than just a television personality. By the late 1960s, he was among America's most well-known faces. Interviews were sought after by magazines. His signature was sought for by studios. He used to be one of the most paid comedians in the nation. The cumulative revenue from his flicks throughout the years exceeded $500 million globally. Barney Fife was no longer the only version of Don Knotts. An entire movie might be carried by his apprehensive charm. Particularly in the Midwest and the South, his name alone could draw crowds to the theater. To cast him, the studios battled. They were aware of his contributions. In 1947, Don Knotts wed Catherine Metz, his college girlfriend. He was unknown, broke, and still figuring out his life's purpose at the moment. Catherine supported him during his gradual ascent into show business for 17 years. However, things at home started to fall apart right after he finally found his calling on The Andy Griffith Show. Don received his first Emmy in 1961. The marriage ended in 1964. He was now one of the most well-known figures on TV, but his fame had a price. He was now juggling the constant demands of celebrity with the upbringing of their two children, Thomas and Karen. At the time, Karen was just 10 years old. Behind the TV smiles, the actual world was anything but happy. Don's personal life never fully recovered, and the strain caused the marriage to break down. Don made another attempt 10 years later. He wed Lorelei Kukna in 1974. She worked in show industry as well, and for a short while, everything appeared stable. However, that tranquility was short-lived. Although Don had always been a nervous person, his despair and worry of getting sick grew unavoidable throughout this marriage. On some days, despite the fact that the physicians could detect nothing wrong, he would lie in bed and believe he was dying. His moods could change so quickly, according to his daughter, Karen. Not even relatives knew who they would be interacting with. Although Laura Lee tried her hardest to help him, living behind closed doors was exhausting. Even while Don was still charming in public, his thoughts were frequently darker in private. Though few were aware of how severely it harmed his marriage, rumors circulated throughout Hollywood that he was in a vulnerable position. Nevertheless, Laura Lee remained by his side through some of his most trying times. The diagnosis followed. That made all the difference. Don was diagnosed with macular degeneration in 1979. He was just 57. He was portraying Ralph Perley on Three's Company at the time, and he was in the midst of a comeback. It couldn't have come at a worse time. He was afraid since his vision was rapidly deteriorating. He was identified by his eyes. People laughed because of those broad, lively expressions. He now feared that he would never be able to read a screenplay without assistance or see his kids' faces clearly again. He was overcome with fear. According to Laura Lee, he began discussing a bucket list as though he were running out of time. He stopped going out. He stayed away from mirrors. He spent days in bed. It was similar to witnessing someone vanish in front of you. The fear of losing his sight took over everything between 1979 and 1983. Don declined to go to treatment. He shoved others aside. Tension increased in the house, and the arguments grew commonplace. In 1983, Laura Lee ultimately departed. She claimed that they were broken after 9 years of marriage because of his dread of getting blind. It was too late to repair what had already been lost, even though surgery later helped restore some of his vision. So, years of quiet and tension had eroded the marriage. It demonstrated that even a man renowned for making millions of people happy wasn't always able to maintain harmony in his own household. Strangely enough, his career was resurrected by the same show that coincided with his health issue. When Three needed a new character after the Ropers left in 1979, Don joined the company. Don returned to the limelight as Ralph Furley at the age of 54. With his outrageous attire and impeccable comedic timing, he infused the show with vitality and ridiculousness. Even if they were unaware of his prior work, younger audiences adored him. Don was given greater screen time by the writers after Suzanne Summers left in 1981. He filled the void with ease. He was once again a key player in a huge TV smash by the time the show concluded in 1984. Despite fighting eyesight loss behind the scenes, his position allowed him to embark on a new chapter in his life. Don grinned and made jokes while the cameras rolled. Off camera, however, he was having more difficulties than anyone knew. It took longer to read the scripts. On set, he occasionally failed to recognize faces. He eventually had to stop driving. He mostly kept this a secret out of fear of being called a liability. He reportedly told buddies that he was afraid of losing his work if they found out. The reality was harsh. He was losing his vision. Parts of the career he had spent decades building were also included. Nevertheless, he appeared. He gave a performance. Even other coworkers were unaware of what he was going through because he wore the mask so skillfully. His family experienced it all. The house became quiet, Lorelei recalled. On some days, Don hardly spoke at all. Claimed that his moods would fluctuate so drastically that nobody could predict which version of her father would enter the house. He grew tense, aloof, and occasionally irate. Friends also observed the change. In the rehearsal phase, he was less fun. He switched the switch after remaining silent until it was time to perform. He frequently returned home exhausted thereafter. The despair loomed over everything for nearly a year. But to the general population, he remained the endearing, smiling face from television. It was a devastating contrast. Finally, a breakthrough occurred. In Los Angeles, Don discovered an expert developing a novel laser technique. The procedure was costly, dangerous, and still in its infancy. Don, however, followed through. It was successful. After receiving treatment for the bleeding blood vessels in his eye, he was able to regain most of his center vision. It wasn't flawless. It restored his independence, but he never read quite the same way again. He was back on the stage 2 months later. He thanked the physicians who assisted him and sobbed alongside his family. He looked forward rather than back for the first time in years. Growing up, Karen Knott was unaware of her father's entire history. She discovered information years later that altered her perspective on everything. The man who made America laugh for decades, Don Knott, was raised in a fear-filled household. Don shared a home in Morgantown, West Virginia, in the 1920s with a father who battled alcoholism and insanity. Frequently, that mixture descended into violence. His own father brandished a knife at him one evening. To get across the home safely, Don had to slip past the sofa. His elder brothers were of no assistance. They occasionally joined in. Because he lived in continual anxiety, he appeared thin and pallid. Karen said it felt like it was soaking into the house. A handmade ventriloquist dummy was his only solace. However, even that was an escape rather than a pleasure. Something inside of him broke when his older brother, Sid, passed away after an asthma attack. Don lived the rest of his life with the wound from that loss. Not only did Karen's findings provide a fresh perspective on her father's early years, they altered the way that people perceived the suffering that underlies his humor. Don acknowledged that, despite his 5 Emmys and more than half-century career, he felt like a failure. "I felt like a loser," he once stated. "The majority of the time I was miserable." He was a household name because to programs like Three's Company and The Andy Griffith Show, he was still that scared little boy on the inside, though. He attended counseling. He struggled with anger, occasionally directed at God. Despite his constant efforts, he was never able to find serenity. His experience demonstrated that childhood trauma does not just go away with achievement. It persists. It molds every aspect of your identity. Fans saw a totally different Don at home than they did on screen. Karen recalled 2 different sides of him. The happy person who everyone adored, and the person who, when no one was around, descended into profound melancholy. She had to help him get out of those bad moods when he was a kid. She claimed to have behaved like a miniature shrink. Don's upbringing with a brutal father and an alcoholic sibling left him with severe scars. However, he kept his own children safe from that darkness. He was kind. He exercised caution. He ensured that they would never experience what he experienced. Later in life, therapy benefited him. The largest difference, though, was Karen's assistance. It might have been considerably more difficult without her. Don married Frances Yarbrough in 2002. He was 78 years old. They had collaborated on the sitcom What a Country nearly 2 decades prior. Despite Frances being more than 30 years younger, they had a strong bond. In his last years, she provided him with solace. His condition was deteriorating by that point. He had lung cancer and macular impairment. Frances became his best friend, his helper, and his companion. They led a calm yet loving life together. Frances received Don's wealth after he passed away in 2006. That was a clear indication of how much she had grown to mean to him. Don had at last achieved serenity after all the suffering of his early years. Early in the new millennium, Don was diagnosed with lung cancer. Even though he had given up smoking over a decade prior, it was insufficient. However, he handled the illness with a sense of humor. That was the unique aspect of his story. He joked when the doctors broke the news to him. He made his family chuckle when the chemotherapy stopped working. He didn't let melancholy win, even though he knew time was running out. He had already escaped almost going blind. He continued to fight with jokes because he understood what it meant to fight. He was more than just a comedian. That's how he got by. When Karen was there in those final days, she recalled something that would stay with her forever. Don continued to joke even as his body failed. She had to leave the room because one of them made her laugh so hard. Although she felt ashamed, it was also lovely. She had received one final chuckle from her father. His gift was that the hospital room vanished, and for a brief instant, everything seemed to be okay. He said them farewell in this manner. However, his last joke was not heard by Karen. She was no longer in the room. It was already too late when she returned. It had slipped her mind. I should have just stood there and burst out laughing, she added later. She remembered that moment. She wasn't tormented by grief. It was the opportunity she lost to share a final chuckle with him. That experience turned into a lesson that laughter is something to cherish even in the end. That smiling is sometimes the greatest way to say goodbye. The death of Don Knotts occurred on February 24, 2006. He was 81. He passed away from lung cancer and respiratory issues, but not before leaving the world in the same state that he had entered. Andy Griffith and other family members and friends were all around him. Even in the end, nurses recalled how he made them laugh. He was that person. He stayed with them. A man who could transform agony into performance and terror into fun. A man who departed with gladness rather than silence.